Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author.
In this episode, we peel back the layers on what seems to be a straightforward question: the US entry into the Second World War. The story leads beyond Pearl Harbor into a web of international tensions, persistent mythology, and even to countries and places like France and China. So, Jesse, today we're looking at, you might say, three different aspects of the same story. So it's, of course, the US in the center of the whole thing, but we're also looking at the Far East, the rise of Japan, the tensions that you get there. We'll unpack all of this. And also, of course, we need to look at Europe, and that basically means Germany mainly. Italy also declares war on the US, but Germany is the main player. So maybe we could start with looking at the European theater, not least because I know much more about the European theater than the other one. So let's unpack that a little bit to begin with. So talk us through some of the reasons, the tensions, and all these things that lead to the German declaration of war on the US in December 1941.
Indeed, there are a ton of layers to this. I think in the public perception, when we think about films or when we think about, what do we know about World War II from high school or from undergrad university experiences, we think Pearl Harbor, right? This is where it all goes down. One of the greatest movies of all time, he said without any degree of sarcasm. That Pearl Harbor movie just about caused me to lose my lunch. But anyway, I digress already, and we're only a few seconds into the podcast here. But it's much more than just Pearl Harbor. There's a whole background to all of this. And I'm happy to say that part of the reason we chose this topic today was because of listener feedback. And one of our listeners wrote us and said, I really want to make sure that you guys talk also about theaters that are outside of Europe. So once we go through our European section here, don't worry. We will get to Asia and we'll talk about Japan. We'll talk about the embargo. We'll talk about China and its role as well, and a few conspiracy theories. Shout out to my old professor at the University of Ottawa, Brian Villa, who had some very interesting ideas that he shared with us about Pearl Harbor. And I think I'm going to take issue with some of them a little later in the podcast. But for Europe, for the old continent where Matthias and I make our homes, I think one of the big issues for the US, oddly enough, is, in terms of European security, is the situation with France. In the interwar period, the Americans kind of, to a certain extent, withdraw. There's a debate about how isolationist were they actually, or what kind of engagement did they want in international affairs. It wasn't in the League of Nations. Maybe it was more bilateral. There's sort of, people weigh those things a little bit differently. But in a way, even though the US kind of withdraws, France remains the linchpin of the, if you want to call it slightly exaggeratedly here, the world order, or at least the part of the world order that the US and Western Europe conceive themselves of being in and upholding. France is kind of the linchpin of that, whether the Americans want it to be or not. Because if France is not a democracy and it's not upholding some kind of peace in Europe, you're going to have a problem. Now, that's a little taster to get us into the European aspect of things. At the same time, back in the US, you have a whole different range. It doesn't mean that every American and every American politician appreciates this or would assess it the same way that I just did, right? That the US interests are bound up with the British and French in upholding certain kind of order. That's easier for us to say now. At the time, in the US, there's a whole different context with the America First Committee, with isolationist sentiments, with the neutrality laws. So, Matthias, give us the tea, as they say these days, on the domestic scene. What's happening in the US on the eve of war, in the couple of years leading up to this decision to go to war?
Well, if we look at what goes on in the US, as I always say, we need to take it a step further back and look at what happened before. You already alluded to a few things. So this whole idea of isolationism, a very, you might say in those days, prominent idea that you find in the US, because they say, well, all of these people emigrated from the old continent to the US because, to keep it simple, they didn't want to have anything to do with the quarrels of the old world. And you can really see this being played out, for example, at the end of the First World War, when you look at the Versailles Treaty. We already talked about this in a different podcast, that they don't ratify this treaty because they say, well, if we ratify this, we are more or less bound and fixed to be engaged and stay engaged in old Europe. And they don't want to do this. So you have all sorts of different factions, different drivers, the different parties doing different things. What we shouldn't forget is that, of course, you still have a very strong German minority, German-speaking minority, German roots, German ancestry, that was much, much stronger and more dominant, you might say, at the First World War, during the First World War. But you still have these sentiments, of course, there in the 1920s and in the 1930s as well. And you already mentioned a number of very important points. For example, the Neutrality Act. So the US actually signs 3 Neutrality Acts, one in 1935, one in 1936, and one in 1937. So this is the time where Europe is already heating up. So you have, for example, the Spanish Civil War. So everyone can see something is happening in Europe. So we're moving towards war. You've got the very aggressive policy by Hitler, and everyone realizes something is going to happen. So the United States, they sign these acts. And the idea behind that is they want to keep the US out of any war in the US by making it illegal for Americans to sell or transport arms or other war material to warring nations, be they aggressors or defenders. So this is very, very clear and isolationist. However, this then changes in 1939. Because the Americans realized that, as you've already said, democracy in Europe is under threat. And in particular, we talk a lot about the special relationship with Britain. Of course, that exists to a degree, even though perhaps the Americans would disagree, perhaps today. But also France. France is a very, very important country. You already mentioned it. We tend to overlook this a little bit because it collapses so quickly in 1940. But to Americans at that particular time, the bond with France was very, very strong. And there are historical reasons for that. Think about the American War of Independence. Think about, for example, the American military. Think about West Point, which are all based on French ideas, on French thinking, and on the French military. So these links are very, very strong. And of course, they'd fought there in the First World War as well. So in 1939, this is then changed. And you then get into the Neutrality Act of 1939, which ends this ammunition embargo on a cash and carry basis, which means you can go into the US, you can buy stuff, and then you take it home again. This, of course, very obviously favors the future, you might say, Western allies, because it's easier for them to go to the States, buy stuff, and bring it back. That was an experience, again, link it back to the First World War, that the Germans had made in the First World War. So they built these very, very big cargo U-boats, which they sent to the US. But that is just a very, very, very small token effort, whereas the Allies, both in World War I and then later on in World War II, of course, get supplied by the Americans in large quantities. So you can see there is an awful lot of that going on already. And that is even before the war has broken out. And when the war breaks out, particularly France falls that quickly, it changes things. So what else happens, Jesse? What else is going on?
Well, I had the same question for you because it seems like there's a pack of dogs who agree with every point that you were making most vocally. Hopefully our sound guys can do something about that. Otherwise, hey, we've got the canine team on our side here for today. I wanted to say a word about the isolationist sentiment in the US. And part of the reason I wanted to say that word is because I found a kind of a cool quote thinking about this episode and sort of looking in a few places that I think summarizes probably the single biggest block of American public opinion leading up to the war, which it's a quote by a congresswoman, Edith Rogers. And she said, "Our own troubles are so numerous and so difficult that we have neither the time or inclination to meddle in the affairs of others." So what this reminded me of is the major domestic problems that the US has, right? The Great Depression. They're hit even worse than some of the other countries in Western Europe by the Great Depression. And so this is kind of one of the consuming aspects. And one of the forms that this isolation takes as well, of course, is this famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, America First Committee, which is made up of, they would call themselves patriotic, or perhaps we might call them nationalistic Americans, who are against any US intervention in the war. Some of them have some Nazi sympathies. Some of them have some anti-Semitic ideas. Many of them do not. Charles Lindbergh, the famous, aviator, was kind of the face, in retrospect anyway, of the movement. So you have all this, and this is like a huge drag on the Roosevelt administration's attempts to react to the international situation. So it's not easy for them to do what they're trying to do, which is prepare. And I looked up a couple of stats just for fun. In October 1939, for example, there was a survey in the US, and the survey asked if it appears that Britain and France are being defeated. So this is October 1939. This is before France has fallen, but Poland has basically fallen. So people are getting a bit afraid of Germany's capabilities here now that they're proving it on the battlefield. If it appears Britain and France are being defeated, should the US declare war on Germany? And in October 1939, 71% of Americans said no. So that's a pretty solid majority not being interested in joining the war. That will change over time, as we'll get to, for different reasons. And one of the catalysts, I think, for this is that in June, July 1940, France falls, and the whole international system, for what it was worth, this kind of partial, fragile, cracked international system that came out of the Versailles Treaty in the First World War, is done. When France falls, that's the end. Before that, you could say Germany is violently challenging that order, but when France falls, that order is over. And this has a huge impact on US security. And my understanding of this question, I owe a debt to a historian in the US, Michael Nyberg, who wrote a great book called When France Fell. And he really brings it, to translate directly from the German expression, he really brings it on to the point. He really puts it succinctly. He says in the book, America's Second World War really began not on December 7th, 1941, but in the critical weeks of May and June 1940. So what he means by that is, of course, not that the US is officially at war with anyone in May and June 1940, but that the leadership of the country realizes that the security situation has changed so dramatically that they're likely going to be involved in some sort of security threat and possibly a conflict, and they really start taking measures to change that.
And you can see how this is being played out at the international scene as well. So, for example, you look at the Destroyers for Bases deal, an agreement which they sign with the British, because at that stage, France has fallen. The great idea, we debunked this myth a little bit in a previous episode, that Britain is now standing all alone. Well, that's not quite true. But Britain is not in a very, very good situation. Also, what the British realize is that in order to keep the sea lanes open, to get more supply, basically first on this cash and carry deal, later on the Lend-lease, we'll talk about that more in a moment, they need to have more maritime power. So they sign a deal with the US, which Churchill wants to keep quiet about first and then doesn't give all the details to the public, because he realizes they're basically surrendering to the Americans. That's the public, well, not the public, but that's the official view, you might say, in British government at that particular time. Because what they do is, the Brits go to the Americans and say, well, first of all, we don't have any money anymore. We are broke, we are skinned, there's nothing left. We can't continue with the cash and carry, we simply don't have it. Leads to the other thing, to the Lend-lease. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also they say we need more ships. So the Americans give them 50 destroyers, mainly quite old ones to be perfect. So they're not the cream of the crop. They're not the brand new ones. The Americans keep them for themselves. But in return for that, the British give the Americans access to a number of their bases. So, for example, they have a 99-year rent-free lease on territories in Newfoundland. I always say that correctly. I always want to see Newfoundland, so Canadians, please forgive me. They also are on the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Antigua, British Guyana, including Georgetown. So there's all sorts of stuff, particularly in the Caribbean, which you might say Monroe Doctrine, or within the American zone of influence. But you can see how Britain is beginning to sell out, because Britain at that stage is broke and there's nothing left. And this is the first time the Americans really get, I wouldn't say aggressively, but quite proactively engaged in the whole thing, because they're really trying to support Britain. Of course, they're trying to get something as well, but it's the first time that you can really see this. So there's a massive, massive change. And as you said, that happens before America officially enters the war. So this is relatively short after the fall of France. So France falls in the summer of 1940, and this deal is signed on the 2nd of September. So quite early on. I've mentioned the Lend-lease. Talk us through it. What happens there?
Well, this is Roosevelt's attempt to soften the neutrality laws to be able to not get the US involved in the war directly, but to be able to help countries that the US considers friendly. It's not like a formal alliance with Britain, but they don't want Germany to win, and they would prefer that Britain somehow is able to prevail or at least hold out until other events change the course of history. So one of the issues holding them back, one of the hitches, is that Britain's never been able to pay back its debt to the US from the weapons it bought in the First World War. And so when the Neutrality Acts restrict that, Roosevelt convinces Congress to be able to amend them to allow this deal called Lend-lease. Now, before I get into the details of Lend-lease, I want to take one step back to the question of Newfoundland, because
that's much better pronunciation than mine, by the way.
I didn't want to leave it. I didn't want to. There's going to be a couple of listeners out there in Newfoundland and Labrador. I don't know if they're going to be in St. John's. I don't know if they're going to be in Goose Bay or Lanceau Meadows or wherever they're going to be. These are all places most of you wonderful listeners will not have the pleasure of visiting in your lifetime, but it's definitely worth it in Newfoundland. I, as a Canadian, a mainlander, would say Newfoundland. But Newfoundlanders out there, if I even got that wrong, let me know. So back to Lend-lease, after that little parentheses for Canadian internal affairs. It's early 1941. Congress allows the Lend-lease deals to go through. Now, what I find particularly interesting is it's not just for Britain. The Lend-lease deal is also extended potentially, so they allow for it to be extended in the future to the Soviets, even though obviously the Soviets are not a friendly country, they're not a democracy. The US is staunchly anti-communist, probably except for a few very small and inconsequential socialist movements. And that is quite prescient in a way. But it's not without its critics. For example, General Marshall, right, in the US, he thinks that Lend-lease is probably a bad idea because he expects, as many observers did, that the UK would be defeated by Germany and then all that aid would be wasted. Whereas if you just keep it at home, you can use it at some time in the future, whether or not the UK is defeated.
And when you look at the Lend-lease, you already talked about the ins and outs. When you just look at the sheer numbers and the volume here, so it's a total of about $50 billion in 1940s money, which is equivalent to, roughly speaking, $670 billion in 2023 money. So that's an awful lot. That's more than 17% of the total war expenditure of the US. And you already mentioned it doesn't just go to Britain. It's a bit like the Marshall Plan after the war, where everyone thinks the whole money just went to Germany. No, it doesn't. It's the same here. So it goes to all sorts of countries. And you already mentioned it's extended to the Soviet Union as well when Germany invades, which I always say, well, here you can see some of the double standards being played out, because the Soviet regime was, let's face it, probably just as bad as the Nazi regime. But so you're supporting these in order to defeat Nazism. So that's an interesting view here. But also, of course, China. And so we'll bring that back when we talk about the tensions between Japan and the States. So the Americans supporting the Chinese later on in their fight against Japan. So there's all sorts of things going on there. And of course, this is something that the Germans picked up as well, because they said, well, you're doing this, so you're supporting them. It's very obvious and clear why you're doing this, because you want Germany to lose. It's also interesting when you look at the real terms. So when you look at the treaty itself, what does the bill actually say? So when it's signed on the 11th of March 1941, it permits the president himself, so he doesn't have to go to the politicians, to Congress, he can do it himself, to sell, transfer, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of to any such government whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. So he decides what he wants to do. He decides what it's going to. And of course, that means he's not going to send things to Japan. He's not going to offer this to Germany. And when you look at what goes on then in the later stages of the war, again, we talked about this briefly in a different episode, In the Soviet Union, you have a very, very large quantity of material that the Soviets use on the battlefield being delivered through this Lend-lease. And there's an argument which says that the Soviet army would have collapsed at the very latest in early 1942 if they hadn't received all this support from the Americans. And it's quite interesting, again, when you look at the numbers and the long-term implications of this. So the United Kingdom, for example, paid off all its debt, there weren't many, in 2006. Whereas the Soviet Union, there was a big dispute about this during the Cold War. So the Soviet Union said, well, we're not paying anything back because actually what happened here is, well, we fought for you, we defended you using your material, but we had all the blood loss. But in the end, they reach a deal. And in 1971, they repay $722 million dollars to the US, and the rest of the red was written off. You're absolutely right. What you said earlier, there's a crucial difference between what happened in the First World War and the Second World War. So in the Second World War, most of the material was actually given for free. And only that wasn't used or that material that hadn't been destroyed was then sold on. But normally, particularly to Britain, at a very, very heavy discount. So Britain only pays about 10%.
On the other hand, I would just also point out that the US is not really engaging in Lend-lease out of a sense of altruism. There is some kind of moral component that they see in their support of the British and then later other allies, including the Soviets, including the Chinese. But it's also an instrument of US policy, right? They feel that their own security depends on the fight against Germany, even if they're not in it yet. And as a part of the Lend-lease agreement with the UK, it includes this concept of consideration. So what that means is the UK is not going to pay cold hard cash anymore since they ran out, as Churchill admitted, as you pointed out. But they're going to give consideration to American interests in the post-war world, setting up a new order, hopefully one that's going to last longer and be more stable than Versailles, is what the thinking is at the time. Before we move on here, because I want to get your thoughts on the German declaration of war, there are a couple of other things that happen. One is, I think you just set the internet on fire with the good old internet debate of, were the Nazis worse than the Soviets or were the Soviets worse than the Nazis? I'll go on the record saying, I think the Nazis were worse than the Soviets, but I'll leave it at that for now. We won't go down that rabbit hole. But of course, the US is taking other measures in addition to this. And one of the important ones that we haven't gotten to yet is what they do on the Atlantic Ocean with their Navy.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they decide that they're going to help protect, that it's in their own security interests to help protect ships carrying weapons and supplies to Britain with the US Navy. And there are even in a certain part, they call it a defense zone, I think, a certain part of the Western Atlantic. And so you do have a few clashes between American vessels and German U-boats before the US is even in the war. There are some shots fired. So that might give us a little hint as to where we're going next, which is the German declaration of war on the US. Some people say this was completely insane. The US was angry at Japan for Pearl Harbor, but all of a sudden Hitler declares war on them. Matthias, help us peer into the German soul. What's going on at that time? Why do they take this leap?
The deep, dark German soul. Absolutely right. There we have it. Well, first of all, when you look at the German view, it might be of interest to look at what is the German perception of the US at that particular time. And a little bit, I keep referring back to the First World War because there's some very, very interesting similarities. So the German understanding of the US, even at that particular time, so 1940, 1941, is actually quite limited. Of course, you have ambassadors, you've got military attaches, all these things, and they send back their reports. Yes, that exists. But apart from that, there is not a lot of understanding in the political leading circles within Germany, because you just need to understand where most of these people came from. So we're now looking at the Nazi state. So most of these are actually coming up from relatively below. They haven't traveled to the US. There are one or two exceptions. Putzi Hanstengel is a very famous example, the man who studied in Harvard. But apart from that, there is an awful lot. And most of the Germans probably get their input, their information on the US and what the US looks like from writers like Karl May, who is probably the most famous writer in Germany. Every German has read the books or seen the films. A lot of them happen in America. Old Shatterhand with his friend Winnetou, the Indian. So this is the picture that everybody has. Apart from that, the understanding is reasonably limited. And what you also have, particularly in the Nazi understanding of the US, they're very, very torn, because on the one hand, they look at the racial aspect. And they say, you know what, say we had an export of Germans for hundreds of years to the US. So actually, here is a nation which is strong because there's a lot of German blood, it's powerful, so there it's really a powerhouse. On the other hand, they then say, when you look at the racial aspect and Nazi ideology, well, you've got the Jew of the Wall Street. And the Jew of the Wall Street is just as bad as the communist Jew sitting in the Soviet Union. It's the whole idea about this thinking of Jewish world domination. So these two systems run by Jews wanting to take over. So that's that. You then also have quite a bit of admiration in the German camp for, what you mentioned, the power of this very young nation. So industry is quite strong. You have things like Goebbels being impressed by Coca-Cola. That he's impressed by the way Ford produces its cars. There is actually a story, I'm not quite sure it's entirely true, that Goebbels was looking at the structure of the Coca-Cola company to build the new structure of the Nazi party on this particular structure of that company. You also have other links which the Germans, of course, like. That's, for example, eugenics. You look at what happens in the US, you look at the problems between the whites and the black and segregation. Of course, this is something where the Germans say, you know what, that works for us. So you're doing it with your black people. We are doing it with the Jews. There's a lot we can learn from them. So you can see there's all sorts of things going on in that area as well. But apart from that, it is quite limited. And the German politicians at that particular time, and also the German military, then look at what actually goes on. We already talked about a number of things that are happening. You have other incidents that push, you might say, the Americans into the war camp. That's how the Germans would see it, or Germany closer to declaring war. So, for example, Iceland is occupied. Iceland is occupied by the British as a big naval base after the German occupation of Denmark. The Brits then say, let's be honest and blunt, the Brits are running out of manpower. They said, you Americans, can you do this? And the Americans then occupy Iceland, which you might say, if you look at the legal position, is more than dubious, but they do that. You then have the famous Atlantic Charter on the 14th of August 1941, where Churchill and Roosevelt meet in the middle of the Atlantic and talk about things, and they come up with these ideas about the future world order, which is, without mentioning it, very, very clearly directed against the aggressive states like Japan, like Germany, like Italy. So that's very, very clear. It talks a lot about self-determination of the people, which is also a very interesting aspect, because Churchill, of course, said, well, that should not apply to the colonies. Again, you can talk about double standards here a bit. That's quite an interesting one. You talked about the security zone, the Pan-American security zone, which the Americans set up. So it's a naval zone. They say everyone comes into the zone has the protection of the US. What they actually do, and they extend the zone later on, so it's quite a big one. When you look at what actually happens, it is not designed, but in reality, it turns out to be quite pro-British. Because what they do, for example, is they trace and track German merchant shipping, and in particular, of course, also U-boats that go in there. And then they send, even though they're supposed to have it encoded in clear, they send out these messages, which the Royal Navy can then pick up. And that means that, for example, a lot of German merchant ships and also some U-boats are then either captured or destroyed by the Royal Navy. So you can see it's moving in this direction already. And what you then have, because when you look at the Battle of the Atlantic, which is raging at this point, so you now have American warships guarding these convoys within that zone. And you have a bit of an escalation here. And there are a number of basically two incidents that are very, very famous. The first one is the Greer incident, which happens on the 4th of September. And what happens there is that a German submarine fired upon the Greer, which is a destroyer, but didn't make any contact. So there was a lot of course, diplomatic towing and froing and hoo-ha. The Americans saying, well, you torpedoed one of our ships, and we're a neutral country. It was flying the American flag. You shouldn't have done that. The Germans saying, no, that's not what happened at all. What happened is that was self-defense, because the Greer was throwing depth charges onto our U-boat. So that wasn't really resolved. But as a consequence of that, the US declared that Germany had been guilty of, as they call it, it's a quote, an act of piracy. And President Roosevelt then announced what became known as a shoot-on-sight order. That German submarines, and that's the quote, "very presence in any waters which America deems vital to its defense," so it's similar phrasing as you find in the Lend-lease treaty, "constitutes an attack. In the waters which we deem necessary for our defense, American naval vessels and American planes will no longer wait until Axis submarines lurking underwater or Axis raiders on the surface of the sea strike their deadly blow first." And then he concludes, "The aggression is not ours. Our concern is solely defense. But let this warning be clear. From now on, if German or Italian vessels of war enter the waters, the protection of which is necessary for American defense, they do so at their own peril." So you can see here's already quite a bit of escalation, even though officially there is still war. And this then really comes to the point, as you said earlier, the sharp end. And this is when the USS Reuben James on the 31st of October 1941 is sunk by a German submarine. Because there is a convoy, they detect a U-boat, the American destroyer puts itself between the U-boat and the convoy. And this is then torpedoed by the German U-boat under Erich Topp, who becomes one of the most famous German U-boat commanders of the war, one of the very few actually to survive. And it is sunk and it goes down, killing about 100 people. So here you have a very clear escalation. Again, of course, lots of political memorandums and accusations thrown from left to right, west to east. Same story. We were attacked first. No, you attacked first. But you can see it's really moving towards this. And this sums it up for the Germans. I'm now cutting a very long story slightly short because I have been talking for quite a while. It sends out this message to the Germans that, you know what, the Americans are already at war. And if we declare war on the Americans now, at least we can officially start sinking their ships, because you have reports coming back from the U-boat commanders saying, we've got all these American merchant ships going into the ports in the UK. We know what they're carrying. We know they're carrying weapons, ammunitions, all these things. If we can sink these, at least that stuff does not get to the front line. And that is one of the main reasons, there are others, why the Germans declare war. And maybe I'll get to the other ones a little bit later. But I've been talking for a while. Jesse, over to you.
Yeah, no, I don't have any bones to pick with anything that you've mentioned. A couple times light bulbs went off. Like I remember reading references. I think that Hitler referred to the US in his own racial terms as a mongrel people in Mein Kampf, I believe. So he was already having these mixed feelings about the Americans from way back.
It's interesting that you mentioned Mein Kampf, because what perhaps some people don't know is that he also wrote a second book, which wasn't published during his lifetime. And when you read the second book and you look at foreign policy, the US is actually the main player. Because first, he thought that, well, you could probably have some sort of alliance with the US. But by the time when he writes the second book, he realizes, because of his ideology of racial purity, and particularly, of course, the question of the Jew, that America, which in his view is run by the Wall Street Jew, as he would call it, is going to be the main enemy of Germany when it comes to the big fight for world domination.
Well, on that note, I'm going to take it back down to a much smaller topic, because in passing, you mentioned Iceland a moment ago. And yes, the British occupied it. Later, the Americans replaced them. But in between, there were Canadian troops used for occupation duties in Iceland. Just want to get my Canadian content out there. We had a listener from Canada write in and say that we had left out Canada in one of our other discussions. So now I'm on the warpath for Canadian content. Sorry, everybody out there. Well, wasn't that Canadian? I just apologized. Anyway, moving on. Let's take it from Iceland all the way over to Asia, because now we're going to get into the Asia-Pacific side of the war. Of course, Pearl Harbor is the big catalyst. It's the Balkans of World War II for the US, so to speak, right? It's the spark that lights the powder keg that was there before. I'll try to give us a brief summary of some of the main steps leading up to this before we focus maybe a little bit more on the period right before, the sort of year plus right before Pearl Harbor, because there's a bunch of things that happened there. And then, of course, there's the huge myth about Pearl Harbor and whether the Americans knew, and so on and so forth. So, of course, Japan has been expansive-minded for some time by 1941. This is not just out of the blue. They start building their empire in the late 19th century. And they're torn. I mean, they have these ideas, right? We want to be like the Westerners, like the Europeans. We have the same right to have an empire as they do. This doesn't go well with Western imperial interests of the US or of the British or of the French or of the Dutch. But a big focus for the Japanese is also towards the Asian mainland. So they're kind of torn. They have a push towards an ideological, let's say, push towards the south, towards the Pacific and the islands, that we should expand in this direction. There's oil in the Dutch East Indies that's quite important because Japan's industrializing but doesn't have sufficient resources. But then there's Manchuria and its resources, and Korea that they've colonized in 1905 and so on. And this kind of dovetails with a huge power struggle in the Japanese system between the Navy and the Army, who are both quite influential and both have different priorities, different views on Japan's future expansion, Japan's security questions, threats, and so on. The big thing, in my opinion anyway, is the war with China. So Japan invades and occupies Manchuria, part of China, northern China, in 1931. And then, of course, the war expands dramatically. Starting in 1937, Japan attacks and occupies many other parts of China, numerous other provinces, all of their main port cities, trying to cut them off from any outside help and to impose a kind of imperial colonialist puppet regime in China. So they have this huge war in China, but they can't finish it. Right? So they get bogged down in this massive war in China, and China's getting some outside support. We talked a little bit about this in a previous episode. They get some support from Nazi Germany, interestingly enough. They get some support from the Soviet Union, but they also do get some support from the British and the Americans, especially financial support. And as time goes by, the Japanese are finding this is a serious problem. We cannot do much until, in terms of our imperial dream, let's say, until we resolve what they call the China incident, which is a nice euphemism, a way of getting around. It was the special military operation of its day for Japan, let's say. It's a nice way of saying we invaded somebody, the China incident. Until they resolve that, they're going to be hamstrung in their efforts to expand their empire in any other direction. So one line of interpretation, one argument that I kind of like, that I find interesting, is that China is kind of at the heart of this eventual conflict between Japan and the United States. Because according to this line of thinking, the priority for Japan is China. And the stumbling block is the US presence and US support for China. It's not necessarily the most popular interpretation. I mean, there, I think we move towards, negotiations between Japan and the United States in 1940 and 41, the infamous oil embargo that the US imposes on Japan. But I think putting China at the center of that has something to it. I like that argument.
I think you're absolutely right. It's very simple when you just look at the geography. So Korea and China are absolutely important, and they play a very, very important role, not least because it's relatively easy to get to. So the point of geography, you talked about the oil embargo. So it does play an absolute vital role. And let's not forget the economic power of China that you also have, which of course you can't compare to what the China that we've got today, but it's still powerful. You have a very large population, even those days, controlling these people and also these natural resources, of course, would give Japan a very, very good and strong hand in that particular area, because everything else, as you mentioned, everything else is far away. So the US, well, there's not much point in invading the US. Why would you? And there are other reasons why the war breaks out. You mentioned oil, and we'll come back to that later. And then when you look further to the southwest and you look at, for example, the British colonies, you look at Australia, the fear of the invasion of Australia. Again, it's very, very far away. There are economic reasons why it is quite useful to go into these parts of the world. And this is one of the arguments that was also, or has been brought forward by lots of people. Also one of the reasons why, for example, swing it back a little bit to Germany for one moment, why Hitler said, no, you Japanese, you should be going down there into that area, go into the British colonies. Because if you do that, the British and also particularly the Dutch colonies, if you capture all these, you will control, roughly speaking, 90% of the rubber production of the world. And of course, the German thinking then is, well, if they do that, even if we declare war on the US, even if they do manage to bring their troops across to Europe, if they are not being sunk by the U-boats, their tanks will not be able to roll, their cars will not be able to roll because they don't have any rubber. So you can see economic ideas behind that as well, which is again an interesting one because you have a very strong ongoing debate between the German, not only military people, but also the politicians and the Japanese in the run-up to the war. So where should you go? And to begin with, the Germans very clearly pushed, no, go down there, go into the Dutch colonies, the British colonies. That's far more important than joining a war on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. We can deal with that. That's fine. That's another episode, by the way, the invasion of the Soviet Union. But this is in the great scheme of things, in a world war, which probably is going to last very long. The economic factor is extremely important. And if you can control mainland China, you already control quite a bit of these natural resources, and you deny the other resources to the enemy by controlling the former British and Dutch and other colonies in that particular part of the world.
Yes, and I remember a phrase from Japanese domestic politics and discussions about empire and expansion and security, perceived security needs and so on, that Korea is a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. So to them, you can't have security, you can't realize your future imperial goals without occupying that part of the world. That is to say, northern China and Korea.
And you just need to look at the end of the war, when again you find that there's still a lot of Japanese troops in Korea for exactly that reason, because that's the shortest distance to mainland China. Everything else, the island hopping and all these things, very, very difficult, costly for the Americans. Much easier to launch a bombing campaign, for example, from Korea.
The Japanese also are influenced by ideology in terms of these expansive ambitions, right? They believe that they're a superior race. The Yamato spirit, I believe, is the word. Forgive me, Japanologists out there, if I got that one wrong, but I think that's the word they use to describe this kind of essence to their race as they perceive it, that gives them the right and the strength to do this sort of thing to their neighbors. But they also cloak this in an anti-colonial rhetoric, right? So they also say, well, we are not just expanding our own empire, but we're liberating Asia from the Western colonial masters, and that Asia will then benefit. The idea of this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which is shorthand for Japanese empire, where the Japanese get and do what they want and what they feel like doing.
And this aspect that you just mentioned is absolutely fascinating. So if I take it out of our comfort zone for a second or two, so post-1945, and you look at decolonization in that part of the world, to a large degree, that was driven by the understanding, the perception of the people living there, that we were part of colonial empires. The Japanese came along, they defeated the British, they defeated the Dutch, the French, whoever they defeated. And then after the war's over, these nations come back and they say, and you are now under our rule again. And of course, the local population say, well, hang on, it doesn't work that way. You were defeated. So here you have a bit of a hangover, you might say, hangover period, a long-term impact of this whole Japanese, not only invasion, but also the ideology that you already talked about.
Yes, I think that's true. Of course, there were ideas before the Japanese conquered these places. There were ideas of colonial emancipation. Some of them were inspired by the First World War and the Versailles Treaty and its League of Nations, the idea of self-determination and so on and so forth. But yes, of course, the fact that the Western powers were defeated in Asia by the Japanese weakens their claim later when they try to return. And one of the places that they unsuccessfully try to return to is French Indochina. What is today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, at the time was a French colony. When France falls in Europe, Japan then occupies it. And this is useful for cutting off one potential supply line to China, and it's also useful for exploiting the resources of French Indochina. And this becomes an apple of discord between the US and Japan, to bring it back now to the lead up to Pearl Harbor, during these negotiations. So when tensions are building, the US wants to stop Japan, wants to convince Japan to stop its violent expansion in China and not to decide to violently expand into Southeast Asia or in the Pacific. That's kind of the US's goal in 1940 and the first part of 1941. And there's a long series of negotiations about this. The Japanese eventually are not serious about those negotiations. And so they're kind of, in the end, negotiating in bad faith just to keep stringing it along while they've already decided on the Pearl Harbor strike. But one of the interesting moments in those negotiations is that, because there's a big deal made about the oil embargo, right? So I've seen lots of critical comments, and some not critical, but just interpretive comments online and in discussions saying, well, the US essentially forced Japan to do Pearl Harbor because they imposed an oil embargo, and that was that. Well, the bad news is Japan was the one making decisions. So they're not necessarily, there's always another option in policy. Nothing is inevitable, as they say. But at one point in the negotiations, the US showed some willingness to lift or soften the oil embargo if Japan would end its occupation of French Indochina. And the Japanese refuse. So there's a whole buildup of tensions. There are these negotiations. There is the embargo, but I think there's some explanatory power to the idea that Japan is so focused on expanding into China that everything is secondary to that goal. And if that means a clash with the US, then that's what's going to happen. And they decide and plan, they plan on and then decide for that well in advance of the ultimate impact of the embargo, for example.
And of course, what you also find when you concentrate on China, a mission creep sets in, doesn't it? So you want to control China, which means you need to cut off all these supply lines and supply routes that go into China so that the people fighting against you can't be supplied anymore. So wouldn't it be a good idea to go into Indochina, modern-day Vietnam? Wouldn't it be a good idea to go into all these other places? Then, of course, you have some really, really astounding successes. The biggest one, of course, the fall of Singapore. I mean, that is the one where we don't talk about this too much in the Western world because probably it's too embarrassing, particularly for the British. But you have one of the largest fortresses in the world, and which falls within I think it's about a day or two, and then it's done. So it looks really, really good for the Japanese. And so this mission creep sets in, and by doing that, you might perhaps say they lose sight a little bit of what the real aim is, the control of China and the territories close to Japan, because they're now beginning to move into other areas, which are really, you might say, of secondary importance, but then, of course, have a very, very important and high impact on the future conduct of war.
Which brings us to our final segment for today's podcast, Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor is well-trodden ground. We're not going to take you through the minute by minute, the hour by hour, the battleship keels over, and so on and so forth. I think we're all of the listeners out there, you folks are probably more or less familiar with it. What I want to focus on, because this is one of our favorite subtopics on every episode, is mythology surrounding World War II and this myth that somehow the US knew and allowed Pearl Harbor to happen in order to have an excuse to go to war. Sometimes you see this idea batted around. It apparently started during the war already. This America First committee that was against the US getting involved in the war floated the idea late in the Second World War. There was a committee that investigated it then with some input from America First. They didn't find anything. And since then, there have been 9 other investigations into that particular topic. And the last one was in 1995, which produced the Dorn report. And they haven't found any evidence, any compelling evidence whatsoever, that this was a deliberate US act to allow Pearl Harbor to happen. They did, however, find what you might expect is a solid historical explanation for getting caught off guard, which is there were all sorts of communication problems within the US military, intelligence, and political institutions. There was incompetence in defensive preparations. There were rivalries and gaps in communication between the services, so between the Army and the Navy, who each had a role to play on Hawaii and at Pearl Harbor. And of course, something that happens very commonly in the history of warfare, including up until today, there were big problems interpreting the intelligence that they did have. So, of course, famously, they had broken some of the Japanese codes and they could read certain communications with the consulate in Honolulu. But that doesn't mean you have the blueprint. It doesn't mean that you know exactly what's happening. And there's no smoking gun out there document that says, oh, and then Roosevelt said, yeah, I know they're going to attack Pearl Harbor, but let's let it happen, right? That's not there. So I think it's an interesting concept, right? People get excited about it and so on. But when you drill down, there's not much there. I mean, the report said in 1995, if I can quote from it here for a second, the evidence of the handling of these messages in Washington, the messages are the intercepted messages from the Japanese to their consulate in Honolulu. The evidence of the handling of these messages in Washington reveals some ineptitude, some unwarranted assumptions and misestimates, limited coordination, ambiguous language, and lack of clarification and follow-up at higher levels. Together, these characteristics resulted in failure by senior Army and Navy leadership to appreciate fully and to convey to the commanders in Hawaii the sense of focus and urgency that those intercepts should have engendered. Now, that's bureaucratic speak for there was no conspiracy. We got caught with our pants down because we weren't paying attention.
And it also points to another thing, which you might perhaps again bring forward to today, where everyone's talking about AI and even more intelligence gathering. And the more intelligence you gather, the better you get at countering the enemy's moves. Well, to put it bluntly, if you've got an idiot interpreting these and not passing these information on, well, you still get stupid decisions. And this is a prime example of exactly this happening. And of course, the other part of this whole myth around it is when the attack finally happens. As the listeners probably all know, the big problem for the Japanese is that they do not find any of the aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor because they're away. This is the other big part of the myth. So the Americans knew what was coming their way. So the aircraft carriers left Pearl Harbor so that they could be used later on in the later stages of the war. Because we're here now at a time of transition and change in naval warfare. And by that stage, in that theater of war, the Pacific, which is huge, most people already understood that the future belonged to the aircraft carrier, not the battleship. Well, just go back, for example, again, switching it to the Germans. How seamlessly did I do this here? Well, look at the sinking of the Bismarck, for example, which was sunk from the air. So you can see there's a very clear move into this. And of course, that all feeds into that myth as well.
And I think the intelligence aspect is key, right? Intelligence is hard to interpret. There's so much noise, there's so much data, and it's very hard to see. Sometimes you can interpret it wrong because you're incompetent. And sometimes you can interpret it wrong because you just don't know. And you make an educated guess that's wrong. And there's one particular example, if we want to, for 1 minute, dip into the nitty-gritty of the US intelligence here. The Japanese send a so-called bomb plot message in October 1941 to the consulate in Hawaii, in Honolulu. And they asked the consulate to send them back in Tokyo the exact coordinates of which ships are moored where in the harbor. Now, that's a sign that the Japanese don't have great intentions for those ships. They're not asking for the coordinates because the prime minister wants to come and visit. The US intercepts that message, decodes it, but they interpret it as a possible sabotage plot. So not that they're going to ship over a bunch of aircraft carriers and mass bomb the entire fleet, but that they might have an idea to plant a bomb on one of the ships. Isn't that a reasonable interpretation as well? So the idea that in hindsight they should have known everything from all of the intel intercepts, I think is just more or less wishful thinking. I think the other big aspect for me in sort of debunking the myth is that if the US in this fantasy land had actually purposefully allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, they would have been better prepared overall. I mean, the US were completely unprepared for war breaking out at that moment. From what I can tell, yes, they expected war with Japan would come when Japan broke off essentially the negotiations in early December, but that doesn't guarantee it's going to happen at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. and I think the proof is in the pudding. The US Army had 190,000 men. They just started conducting a big series of maneuvers in Louisiana where they did not perform particularly well. And Marshall has to go and testify before Congress because of this sort of scandal. The garrisons that they had in key areas that you would expect to prepare if you're thinking, well, Japan is going to attack us. The garrisons they had in Wake Island in the Philippines, totally weak, undermanned, not enough air power, and there's no plan to help them if the Japanese attack them, as they end up doing, right? So I feel like that's another element to debunking the myth is that, look, if the US had planned this, they would have prepared. There's no question that they would have done something more.
And of course, this whole thing can be seen from different angles. You already looked at quite a few of those. There's also one, but if you get this message and then you send it back to Washington and say, well, the Japanese are coming, well, that can have two reactions to it. The first one is, of course, well, that means, well, immediately we now need to prepare for war. But on the other hand, that might be seen as warmongering. And particularly when you have a very weak military, not only army, but military on the whole, is that what you want to do? Because that might push perhaps the Japanese into doing something that you're not ready for at this particular stage. So is it not better to have some sort of, well, let's use the British term here, British policy of appeasement, even though an oil embargo is not really appeasement, but buy some more time to build up a stronger military and then face the enemy. So it can go, again, in very, very different directions.
What a tangled web history weaves for us, folks. So that was it for today. That was our exploration, if you will, of the US entry into the Second World War, both in the Euro-Atlantic theater and the Asia-Pacific theater. Let us know what you thought in the comments. Write us an email. Are you on board with us kind of emphasizing China and France as their role? I thought that was a fresh kind of look, but let us know what you think. What do you think about the Pearl Harbor situation? And maybe we'll get to some of your questions in one of our future episodes. So do drop us a line. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Expansion. No. And they're also to... Jesus Christ. There are also two. Also two. Who says also two? I'm really going back to my country roots now during this stay in Canada. Anyway,